This is the actual process for generating carbon credits, and it looks a lot more complicated than it is. As a consultant advisor, it's not my job to make, it's not in my best interest to make these things look too simple. We've got to make them look very complicated. There is a regulatory process we go through. However, this diagram, really all it's trying to say is that basically the top 3 stages you only have to do once. The first stage that we look at is to check the project eligibility and viability. That is the absolute first stage. Is the activity I'm undertaking eligible? Is it on the positive list? Is it not on the negative list? Is there an approved methodology? Is it within the scope of the CFI? That's all good. The next stage is not compulsory, but it's strongly recommended. And that's where you undertake a viability test. Does this make good economic, environmental, agricultural sense? You technically don't have to do it, but I would suggest that you do. Is this change in land management worth it? All right, does the carbon benefit or the environmental or agricultural benefits outweigh the burden of activities or administration? And if you get to that point, you say, yeah, you know, it's okay. We can do that. The next stage is then if you decide, okay, we want to do this activity, then someone has to take responsibility for the activity. And that person is known as the project proponent or the recognised offset entity. So you go through a process of creating, becoming a recognised offset entity under the scheme, which means basically filling out a really big form, about 38 or 48 pages I think it is. You don't have to fill out all of it. You can register as a recognised offset entity as an individual, as a company, as a body corporate, as a trust. There's a whole range of ways of doing it. And basically what the recognised offset entity application does is goes through a process to prove that you're actually a responsible individual or company and that you have the ability or capacity to undertake the project and take on the scheme obligations. So they have to do an Australian Federal Police check, for example. They make sure that you're not a fraud, bankrupt, and you haven't broken any of the relevant acts. It actually doesn't take that long. It looks much worse than it is. And you submit all that documentation to what's known as the Clean Energy Regulator, who is the scheme regulator of this, an independent body put up in Canberra. So you got through those first 2 components of the chevron. The next one is to register the project. And this is again, whether it's a sequestration project or you have to tell people where it is, where are the project boundaries, what methodology am I using, what documentation do I require, and you need to put all that together and you hand it into the government. And if you're doing a sequestration project, you have to look at obtaining your notification of consent and conformity with statutory plans. And you put all that into the government. They'll declare your project eligible if it's all in place. Everything's right. Then the last 2 are the cyclical ones. The last 2 at the bottom of this page or this slide is where we're looking at actually running the project. How do we monitor the project? And we have to report on the project. So each methodology will have a different range of monitoring requirements. For example, under permanent environmental plannings, you have to look at what your fuel use is in managing the project. What emissions have come from the project? Has it been burnt? How much firewood did you collect? Did you prevent grazing for 3 years? The burden of proof is always on the project proponent, so you need to be able to keep good records. Then once you've done that, you can, after a 12-month period minimum, you can go in and say, okay, now I'd like to get some carbon credits, so I need to report, I need to put all my documentation together and send it to the government. They will then, well, before then, you'll actually have to get an independent third party to do a verification of it. So someone will come in and they have to be an approved verifier, someone on the panel of approved verifiers that the government has, and they'll want to look at all the documentation. Do you still own the land? Do you actually own it? Have you got obtained the notification of consent? When did you plant the trees? How do you prove that you planted the trees? How do I know that you actually spread the urea inhibitor on the paddocks and didn't pour it down the creek? So these are the considerations when you're planning a project to actually have to be able to prove it. And the verifiers are going to look for cracks. They're going to look for ways to disprove what you've done. That's just their nature. And once you've got through that part, then you can get down to the creating and trading your carbon credits. So you get to the bottom point and you say, okay, well, everything's good, the government's happy. You request an issuance of credits and the government will then put credits in your account. You can set up an account called an Australian National Registry of Environmental Units account, and that's where the credits go, and that's where you do your trading. So you can either get them, you can either trade them or hold them. You have to maintain your carbon on site, and then right down the bottom here is some compliance, termination and transfer issues as well, but we'll get to them later. So whilst that looks a lot more complicated than it actually is, it is the actual process that you have to go through to create carbon credits. When it comes to the Carbon Farming Initiative, we actually create 2 different types of carbon credits. So, in Australia, under the Kyoto agreements, when we ratified the carbon the Kyoto Protocol in 2007 to much fanfare for that bloke Rudd, I think it was. Basically, we became responsible for a series, for some of the emissions coming from our country. When we signed the Kyoto Protocol originally in 1997, we were able to elect which emissions we were responsible for and which ones we just report on but not are responsible for. Essentially, Australia got given 2.6 or 2.9 billion tonnes of what are known as allocated allowance units or credits from the Kyoto system, and every time our economy creates an emission, we had to hand one back. Every time you cut down a hectare of trees, you have to hand some back. Every time some trees grow, we didn't have to hand them back. So we were responsible for certain things and we weren't responsible for certain things. And if you have a look at those two far left boxes, you'll see that the top, we look at things like deforestation, where you're actually reducing the forest extent, livestock emissions, nitrogen in agricultural soils and rice, and burning savannas. Those emissions that we are actually responsible for. But if you undertake the sequestration abatements such as reforestation, manure management, fertiliser management, etc., you create what's known as Kyoto CFI credits. So they're the ones that are in our international accounts or we're responsible for internationally. So we create these Kyoto CFI credits. Down the bottom you look at things like soil carbon depletion, non-Kyoto vegetation, and the definition of Kyoto vegetation is vegetation that is greater than 2 metres tall and 20% crown cover at maturity. Right? Other vegetation is eligible, but for Kyoto stuff it has to be what we call 2 and 20. Now, those bottom ones there, you look at activities or abatements such as soil carbon sequestration, non-forest veg management, improved forest management, creates non-Kyoto CFI. There's a very big difference between them because under the carbon tax, it is only the top row that companies can use to offset their carbon liability. So the companies, the liable entities, the big ones, are looking for Kyoto CFI credits at the moment. They're not looking for non-Kyoto CFI credits. And there's a very big difference between them. It doesn't matter which one I'm creating, I still have to follow that previous process. I still have to go through the monitoring and reporting and verification. I still have to do the same applications. I've got exactly the same paperwork. I have the same amount of effort to do, but I create different valued credits. It's the intent that we can sell the non-Kyoto CFI credits overseas, but that's into the voluntary market. And the voluntary market is a very much smaller market with much lower prices. Should the coalition get in, there's going to be a blending of these two markets. But as it stands at the moment, it's only those top row Kyoto CFI credits that can be sold to liable entities. Is everyone very clear on that? Because that's pretty important to know. Because there's one big one in that bottom row that gets a lot of attention. Yeah, exactly, the soil carbon. It gets a lot of attention, but we know that the coalition under the Direct Action Plan have said that they want 80% of their credits to come from soil carbon. So when it comes down to it, really the action's in the top row. That's what companies are after, and that's what we're chasing. So what are the opportunities? Well, there's a whole range of opportunities. If you think in terms of sources and sinks, right, fertiliser and manure management, reduction of enteric fermentation, changing the flora and fauna in an animal's guts, reducing deforestation, looking at crop residue, rice emissions management, legacy landfill emissions, savanna burning, etc. Those sorts of things are where emissions come from, and if we can abate those and stop those going into the atmosphere, fantastic. All right, that is an emission. That's a project. Some of the big opportunities, realistically, are things like enteric fermentation. All right, if you can get your cattle off quicker, or change the feedstock, or change the grazing patterns to get more meat, less methane, that's a good one. That's where most of our emissions in the agricultural sector come from. The other one is pretty straightforward, which is the sinks. That's again where we take it out of the atmosphere and store it in the vegetation and the soils. And we're looking at things like native planting, agroforestry, improved forest management, soil carbon sequestration. Just remembering that those sequestration ones are the ones that have that long-term maintenance obligation. Some of the basic rules for forestry. When you're undertaking a project and you want to create Kyoto credits out of forestry, you need to be actually undertaking revegetation activities on land that was basically 80% clear of vegetation on the 31st of December 1989. So if you're in the helicopter, you've all got helicopters, haven't you? You're in your helicopter looking down over your paddock, you need to see basically 80% grass or dirt, preferably grass. Or it was legally cleared afterwards. It needs to be cleared for at least 5 to 7 years. It changes a little bit depending on the land tenure, and I won't go into that, prior to planting. It needs to be, that's so we can stop people just going in barrelling over bush and replanting trees and saying, give me carbon credits, aren't I good? It has to be revegetated after the 1st of the 7th, 2007. The asterisk is there because there are some provisions for people who have planted before that, But if you did plant before that, you would need to have registered the carbon rights on title within 2 years of planting it. There's lots of little rules in there, ladies and gentlemen. You have to be revegetated by human-induced means. That means it needs to be either direct seeded or planted. Or you can do natural regeneration as well, but you need to prove that there was some human-induced method to do it. You need to get to that 22 and 20 rule for Kyoto. So that's over 2 metres at maturity and over 20% canopy closure at maturity. And it has to be in areas greater than 0.2 of a hectare or half an acre. All right, now that's the minimum size that is allowable under our Kyoto rules. That doesn't mean that's viable. Because it does, one of the key things that we have to understand is to get this thing to Carbon Farming Initiative to work for landholders is you have to get economies of scale. Either get big on your own or get in a gang and get big. Harvesting is treated as an emission, right? If you cut a tree down, it's considered that it rots on the spot instantly. Now we know that's not true. We know scientifically, we know that carbon is stored in the environment for a long time. We know that it's in wood panels, it's in buildings, it's in chairs, etc. But it's an accounting nightmare to figure out who owns it, who's responsible for keeping it there, who owns that piece of furniture or that house for 100 years. It's probably no longer associated with that parcel of land because it's been shifted off, so the easiest thing to do is say, right, it's just treated as an emission straight away. As mentioned numerous times, carbon must remain on site for 100 years. But there are issues with that, obviously, particularly if you have things like fire events. So what do we do? Well, remember earlier I mentioned that risk of reversal buffer? This is where this comes into play. If we do have a fire event or another depletion event such as a long-term drought or insect attack or fungal attack or something like that, the government will actually give you 10 years to recover from that depletion event. And what that means is during the 10 years, particularly like after a fire, and this was a fire in the Strzelecki Ranges in Victoria, it's a particularly warm fire, but as you can see it didn't actually kill the trees, but you can see that already, and I don't know if you can see, it's a long way away for you guys, I'm really close. This is all regrowth under here, and you can see there's a lot of epicormic shooting going on out of the trees, and the trees are actually recovering. If you had a look at that, if someone turned up to look at that, they'd say, well, at some point the carbon's going to be back. As long as they haven't changed the land change, it is going to recover and the carbon's going to be there again. So they're not going to turn up in a big black limousine with a big black bag and balloon and say, give me my carbon dioxide back. Right, what they'll be saying is you need to take all reasonable steps to get the carbon or get the project back to where it was prior to the depletion event. And that's because they keep that 5%. So they keep the 5% and they know the integrity of the scheme is maintained. You've got to take those reasonable steps, but you can't sell any more carbon from that site until it reaches its pre-depletion event status. So if you have a fire, you've got 100 tonnes on site, fire goes through, you lose 30 tonnes, starts recovering, 10 years down the track, you're now back up to 101 tonnes, you're back in the game. But it just puts your project to a hiatus. All right, when you're doing forestry, again, this is sort of like looking at the general eligibility. And this is basically just a patch of remnant vegetation. It's been there since 1990. That's this green area here. And what I'm trying to show here is that there is different types of eligibility. This nice square box over here is basically land that was clear in 1990 has been direct seeded or planted. That's Kyoto. All right, that creates Kyoto credits. Over the other side, that unattractive looking blob, where it says non-Kyoto, is natural regeneration that is occurring on land that was clear in 1990. That creates non-Kyoto credits. This bit in here, the blue blob, is basically an area that was forested in 1990, was legally cleared after 1990, and is now regenerating. That creates Kyoto credits. And then an area at the top here, which is forested now, was forested in 1990, but is at risk of being cleared. You have the permit and the regulations have just been, or the recommendation for the regulations that you had a clearing permit issued before the 1st of July 2010. And if you can avoid that clearing and preserve that forest, you'll get carbon credits, Kyoto carbon credits for that as well. Some of the other considerations that you're looking at actually doing permanent environmental plantings, one of the methodologies that are out there, is basically the smallest management unit we use is something called a carbon estimation area. And a carbon estimation area is essentially a stand of trees that has the same growth rates, the same management principles, the same disturbance history, the same planting history that we can model as one unit. So each carbon estimation area must be planted within 30 days. We do get a lot of people, particularly in peri-urban areas, that say, I've been revegetating my property over the last 20 years. I've planted, 5,000 trees a year. I do 10, 100 every weekend. And that's what I've done for the last 20 years. Can I have carbon credits? Sadly, no, you can't, because you didn't plant within 30 days for each carbon estimation area. So when you're looking at doing these, and particularly for CMAs or natural resource management agencies or environmental managers, there are considerations when you're going into planting. You have to look at each area and plant it over a period of time. You have to look at things like what aspect, slope, soil type is occurring, because that creates a CEA. You need to monitor or verify or fuel use for all events such as any fire event, fertiliser, pruning, change in ownership, etc. And you have to have species that are consistent with the local native vegetation. So you've got to plant things that are basically ticked off by the CMA or the land care group. So looking at the trees that are common to that area or native to that area. There's a whole heap of other things in there that I won't go into. A methodology that got approved on February the 6th after quite a bit of discussion is a new one called human-induced revegetation of even-age permanent forests. I had a fair bit to do with the actual development of this methodology, and the reason that we really wanted this one developed because it gets rid of one of those huge capital costs up front. It gets rid of the need to plant the trees. If you can prove that a forest area is naturally regenerating, and typically it would be cleared or prevented from becoming forest, and you can change that management, you can show a clear decision to change that management, as in typically what we do when this regrowth comes back is we'd blade plough it. This is particularly interesting in Western Queensland, Western New South Wales, where we'd blade plough it, we'd pull it with D10s or chains, or we'd spray it with Tordon, or we'd graze the billy-o out of it to get rid of it. But because of this carbon credits business, we've decided not to this year, and we're going to let it grow, and we're going to let it grow on for good. You have to make sure that it was less than 2 metres tall at the start of the project. It's got to be there for 100 years, and it can create Kyoto and non-Kyoto carbon credits, as per that previous slide where it has to have been cleared country. This is the silver light version too. So basically it's a good one in many regards because you don't pay for that cost of revegetation, and it can make better returns than having to pay for $2,500–3,000 for each hectare you have to plant. So I don't know if you'd have much of it around here, but it's certainly one option.